Harlem in the late 1930s did not sleep, it simmered. The streets pulsed with trumpet notes leaking from basement clubs, laughter spilling from brownstone stoops, the rhythm of shoes striking pavement with purpose. But beneath the music lived something else, something heavy and unspoken. It was the knowledge that joy here was fragile, that dignity had to be defended daily, that power wore uniforms and often mistook authority for righteousness. On the corner of 135th Street and Lenox Avenue stood a narrow brick building with faded gold lettering. Williams and Daughter Books and Stationery. It wasn't grand. It wasn't loud. But inside that small shop, dreams were sold one page at a time. 18-year-old Ruby Williams worked the counter every afternoon. Her fingers stained faintly with ink, her eyes brighter than the city skyline at dusk. She had inherited her father's steadiness and her mother's gentleness, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who believed education was a doorway no one could close. She knew every child's favorite storybook and every elder's preferred newspaper. She believed words could build bridges where politics only built walls. But Harlem was changing. The Great Depression had not merely bruised the neighborhood, it had tightened its grip. Jobs disappeared, banks folded, and patrol cars seemed to multiply like shadows at sunset. Authority was no longer something distant. It was visible on every corner. And though the newspapers called it order, the people who lived here felt something closer to surveillance. It was during one of those heavy afternoons that Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stepped into the bookstore. He did not announce himself. He never did. He wore a dark overcoat despite the heat, hat tilted just enough to shade eyes that missed nothing. He was not tall in stature, but there was something immovable about him, like a pillar placed exactly where it belonged. Conversations softened when he entered rooms, not from fear, from awareness. Ruby looked up from arranging new arrivals and offered a polite smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Johnson." His voice was calm, almost melodic. "Afternoon, Miss Ruby. How's business?" "Treating you? Business is honest," she replied. "That's enough." A faint smile touched his face. He respected that answer. Bumpy was known throughout Harlem, sometimes whispered about in caution, sometimes spoken of with admiration. But those who truly understood him knew one thing: he valued dignity above all. He did not tolerate humiliation of his people. He did not respond recklessly. And he did not forget injustice. He purchased a book of poetry that day, Langston Hughes, paid in exact change. And before leaving, he said something that lingered. "Keep the lights on in here," he told Ruby quietly. "Books are harder to silence than people." She did not fully understand why his tone felt heavier than usual. 2 nights later, the lights in Williams and Daughter went dark. It began with a routine inspection. At least that was the official explanation. 2 city officers arrived just before closing, claiming complaints of improper licensing. Ruby's father, Samuel Williams, a gentle man with silver at his temples, presented every document requested. His hands trembled slightly, not from guilt but from knowing how quickly explanations could become accusations. The officers did not shout. They did not curse. They simply spoke with a tone that carried quiet dismissal. "There seems to be a discrepancy," one of them said, flipping pages without reading. "We'll need to shut you down until this is sorted." "For how long?" Ruby asked, her voice steady. The officer did not meet her eyes. "As long as it takes." The notice was nailed to the door before sunset. "Closed pending investigation." No evidence of wrongdoing was presented. No clear violation cited. Just a silence forced upon a small business that had never missed a tax. Payment in 20 years. By morning, the street felt different. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering. Some urged Samuel to let it go. Others warned against pushing back. Everyone understood the invisible rule. Compliance meant survival, but Ruby did not accept silence easily. That evening, She walked the 4 blocks to a modest apartment above a restaurant known for its late-night conversations. She climbed the stairs without hesitation and knocked once. Bumpy opened the door himself. He had already heard. "Come in," he said simply. The room smelled faintly of cigar smoke and paper. Books lined the walls. A chessboard rested unfinished. On a small table by the window, Ruby stood straight, despite the weight pressing on her chest. "They shut us down without cause." Bumpy listened without interruption as she recounted every detail. The wording, the tone, the way the notice was placed like a verdict already decided. When she finished, the room was quiet. Finally, he spoke. "Did they threaten you?" "No." "Did they insult you?" "No." "Did they give you a reason?" She hesitated. "Not a real one." Bumpy nodded slowly. "Sometimes," he said, "power doesn't need to shout to be unjust." He did not promise retaliation. He did not vow revenge. Instead, he poured 2 glasses of water and handed one to her. "Go home tonight," he said. "Calmly. Lock your doors. Keep your father calm. Let me think." Outside, Harlem's night carried tension beneath its rhythm. Dutch Schultz, powerful, calculating, accustomed to influence, had recently extended his reach deeper into Manhattan's undercurrents. His operations thrived on control and small independent businesses that did not align with certain interests often found themselves inconvenienced. Dutch respected Bumpy, but respect between powerful men was rarely simple. The next morning, Bumpy walked Lenox Avenue alone. He observed everything. Which patrol cars lingered too long, which merchants avoided eye contact, which city inspectors suddenly seemed overworked in one specific neighborhood. He did not confront. He gathered. By afternoon, he requested a meeting, not with police. Not with City Hall. With Dutch. The meeting took place in the back room of a jazz club closed for daylight hours. Dust floated in thin beams of light, cutting through curtained windows. Dutch sat at a polished table, immaculate suit, expression unreadable. "Ellsworth," Dutch greeted smoothly. "Dutch." There was no hostility, only awareness. Bumpy did not sit immediately. He remained standing, hat in hand, a bookstore on 135th, he began calmly. "Closed without cause." Dutch leaned back slightly. "City matters, not mine." Bumpy's eyes remained steady. "Perhaps, but patterns interest me." A pause lingered between them, thick, deliberate. Dutch folded his hands. "You suggesting something?" "I'm asking whether inconvenience is being used as persuasion." Dutch's jaw tightened, just slightly. "Business requires cooperation." "Cooperation," Bumpy repeated quietly, "is voluntary." Silence. It was not a threat. It was not an accusation. It was a line drawn without being drawn. Dutch studied him for a long moment. He knew Bumpy was not reckless. He knew escalation would ripple beyond one storefront. "Let me look into it," Dutch finally said. Bumpy nodded. "Once. I would appreciate clarity." He placed his hat back on his head and left without another word. 3 days passed. On the 4th morning, a different inspector arrived at Williams & Daughter Books and Stationery. He reviewed documents thoroughly this time. He asked respectful questions. He removed the closure notice before noon. "No violations found," he said, almost stiffly. The lights inside the bookstore flickered back to life that afternoon. But something had shifted. Ruby watched her father reopen the door with trembling relief. Neighbors stepped inside one by one, not just to purchase supplies, but to stand witness to restoration. Later that evening, Bumpy returned quietly. Ruby met him at the counter. "You fixed it." He shook his head gently. "I clarified it." "How?" "I reminded someone that pressure applied carelessly can become costly." She studied him, searching for more explanation. There was none offered. Instead, he purchased another book, this time on constitutional law, and before leaving, he said something she would never forget. Justice doesn't always arrive loudly. But when it does, it must be steady. Outside, Harlem exhaled. The music returned, slightly stronger. The air felt less suffocating, but deeper forces were still moving, because somewhere beyond Lenox Avenue, someone had noticed that Bumpy Johnson had quietly intervened, and powerful men rarely enjoy being reminded that their influence has limits. As night settled over the city, a black sedan idled across the street from the bookstore, longer than necessary. Inside sat a man taking notes. The bookstore had reopened. But the story had only begun. The black sedan remained parked across from Williams and Daughter long after the shop lights dimmed that evening. It did not honk. It did not move abruptly. It simply waited, engine idling like a patient predator. Harlem had learned to recognize that kind of stillness, the kind that watched without blinking. Inside the bookstore, Ruby balanced the day's ledger while her father swept the wooden floorboards in slow, deliberate strokes. Business had returned, even increased. Neighbors stopped by with warm smiles and quiet congratulations. But celebration felt fragile, like glass placed too close to the edge of a table. Ruby sensed it first, that subtle shift in the air when victory feels temporary. Across town, Dutch Schultz sat behind an enormous oak desk, reviewing reports. That had nothing to do with books and everything to do with control. He had not ordered the bookstore's closure directly, but he had created an environment where small businesses understood the benefit of alignment. Compliance built stability. Independence built friction, and friction, in certain circles, required correction. A man stepped into Dutch's office, hat in hand. The inspector reversed the closure. Dutch did not look up immediately. "I'm aware. And Johnson?" Dutch finally raised his eyes. They were not angry, they were calculating. "Johnson prefers conversation to chaos. That makes him dangerous." The man shifted uneasily. "You want us to send a message?" Dutch leaned back in his chair. No broken windows, no headlines. Nothing loud. His voice cooled further. "Just remind them that survival requires cooperation." The black sedan across from the bookstore pulled away shortly after midnight. The following afternoon, Ruby was alone when two sharply dressed men entered the shop. They did not carry badges. They did not introduce themselves as officers. But their posture radiated authority of a different kind. "We're here to offer protection," one of them said pleasantly. Ruby did not stop organizing the shelf in front of her. "We've never needed it before. Times change." "So do people," she replied evenly. The second man stepped closer to the counter. His tone remained polite, but his eyes hardened. "You're young. It would be unfortunate if circumstances became complicated." There it was. Not a threat. A suggestion. Ruby felt her pulse quicken, but her voice did not tremble. "My father handles business matters." "Then we'll return." They left as smoothly as they arrived. That night, Ruby did not go home first. She went to see Bumpy. He was seated at the same small chessboard by the window when she entered, studying a position as if the pieces held answers beyond the game. He did not ask why she had come. He could see it in her face. "They came today," she said quietly. "Describe them." She did, every detail. The cut of their suits, the way one tapped the counter twice before speaking, the faint accent in the other's voice. Bumpy listened without interruption. When she finished, he moved a single chess piece forward. A pawn, deliberate and unhurried. "They want you to believe protection is necessary," he said. "It isn't?" "Protection offered without request is leverage disguised as kindness." Ruby folded her hands. "If we refuse, then they test your resolve." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, she asked the question that had been sitting heavy in her chest. "Will you stop them?" Bumpy looked at her carefully. "I will not escalate them." That answer was not what she expected. "You said justice must be steady," she pressed. "And it must," he replied calmly. "But steady does not mean reactive." He rose from his chair and walked to the window, gazing out over Harlem's rooftops. If I push too hard, they push harder. And when powerful men push harder, innocent people get crushed in between. So we do nothing? His voice remained even. We prepare. The next 2 days unfolded like slow thunder gathering behind clouds. Word spread that certain businesses on Lenox Avenue had accepted protection agreements. A few merchants quietly signed papers, others hesitated. The pressure was subtle, but persistent. Deliveries delayed, permits reviewed, licenses questioned. Williams and daughter received a second inspection notice. This time, it cited fire code violations. When the inspector arrived, he found no blocked exits, no faulty wiring, no reason to condemn the shop. But he left behind a warning. Further review pending. Harlem began to murmur again. Dutch heard the murmurs. He did not like instability. He preferred clean systems, arrangements where everyone understood their role. Bumpy's interference had introduced unpredictability. Another meeting was arranged. This time, Dutch did not wait in a jazz club. He invited Bumpy to a more visible location, a high-end restaurant downtown. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, patrons who pretended not to notice who sat where. The symbolism was deliberate. When Bumpy arrived, he was composed as ever, dark suit impeccable, eyes calm. Dutch gestured toward the seat across from him. You're complicating matters. I'm clarifying them, Bumpy replied smoothly. Dutch poured wine into both glasses. Your bookstore friends are refusing reasonable arrangements. They are refusing coercion. Dutch's jaw tightened. You assume intent. Lie. Observe patterns. The tension between them did not flare. It simmered. Dutch leaned forward slightly. You protect one shop. Others think they can defy structure. And if structure requires fear, Bumpy said quietly, it isn't structure. It's intimidation. The word lingered between them like smoke. Dutch set his glass down carefully. Careful, Ellsworth. Bumpy met his gaze without blinking. I always am. Silence enveloped the table. Nearby diners pretended to focus on their meals, though the air felt heavier. Dutch broke the quiet first. You think you can outmaneuver pressure with patience. I think dignity lasts longer than dominance. For the first time, a flicker of frustration crossed Dutch's face. You're gambling, he said. Bumpy's response was almost gentle. No, I'm investing. He stood, placed payment for both meals on the table, and left without another word. The following morning, something unexpected happened. A respected journalist from a prominent city paper published a detailed article about aggressive protection tactics emerging in Harlem. It did not name Dutch directly. It did not accuse anyone outright. But it outlined patterns. Businesses pressured after refusing alignment, inspections that coincidentally followed. Independence. The article concluded with a line that cut deeper than accusation. Communities thrive not under fear, but under fairness. Dutch read it twice. He understood what had happened. Bumpy had not fought him in the streets. He had not threatened retaliation. He had quietly shifted the battlefield from shadow to scrutiny. Pressure works best in darkness. Under light, it weakens. By late afternoon, the men who had visited Ruby's bookstore returned, this time with softer expressions. Misunderstandings occur, one of them said. No need for further discussions. Ruby held their gaze. We never required protection. They nodded stiffly and left for the last time. That evening, as the sun dipped below Harlem's skyline, Ruby found Bumpy standing outside the bookstore. It's over? She asked. For now, he replied. How did you do it? He looked down the street where children played hopscotch, where music drifted once more from open windows. I reminded someone, he said quietly, that reputation is more expensive than control. Ruby felt something shift inside her. Not just relief, but understanding. Power did not always need confrontation. Sometimes it needed exposure. As night settled, Dutch stood alone in his office, staring out at the city lights. He was not defeated, but he had recalculated. Bumpy Johnson had drawn a boundary without violence, without chaos, without spectacle. And that made him far more formidable than any man who relied on fear alone. Across Harlem, the bookstore's lights remained on longer than usual that night. People lingered. They spoke softly. They felt safer, but somewhere in the city's machinery, gears were still turning, because men who lose influence rarely forget it. Harlem had learned to breathe again. The bookstore lights stayed on later now, glowing like a quiet defiance against the dark. Children once again pressed their noses against the window to see the newest arrivals. Elders lingered inside, speaking in low tones about poetry, about history, about hope. For a brief moment, it felt as if dignity had won something permanent. But power does not surrender so easily. And when it cannot break a community publicly, it searches for softer targets privately. 3 weeks after the newspaper article, Ruby Williams was offered a scholarship interview at a prestigious Manhattan college, one that had rarely admitted students from neighborhoods like hers. She had applied months ago in secret, not wanting to burden her father with expectations. Education was her dream, her ladder beyond limitations. The letter arrived embossed, formal, promising. Samuel Williams wept when he read it. "You will go further than this street," he told her, voice thick with pride. Ruby prepared carefully for the interview. She borrowed a modest but elegant dress from a neighbor. She rehearsed answers late into the night, speaking into the mirror about literature, about civic responsibility, about her desire to teach one day. What she did not know was that someone else had also received news of her interview. Dutch Schultz had never considered Ruby Williams personally significant. She was a bookstore clerk, a symbol at most. But symbols, when left unchecked, could become statements. And statements, when amplified, became movements. One of his associates brought him the information quietly. "The girl from the bookstore has a scholarship review, downtown, big donors involved." Dutch listened carefully. He was not cruel for sport. He was strategic. And strategy required long memory. "Influence the review," he said finally. "Deny her?" "No," Dutch replied. "Slowly complicate her." The day of the interview arrived with cold rain. Ruby traveled alone by subway into Manhattan, clutching her folder of essays and recommendations. The campus felt enormous, polished, distant. Marble steps, tall columns, students who moved as if the world had always belonged to them. She checked in at the admissions office and was directed to a waiting room lined with oil portraits of benefactors. The secretary smiled thinly. "Miss Williams, we'll call you shortly." Minutes stretched into an hour. Then 2. Other applicants came and went. Finally, she was summoned. The interview panel consisted of 3 men and 1 woman, all impeccably dressed, all polite in a way that felt rehearsed. They asked about her grades, her extracurricular activities, her aspirations. Ruby answered with grace, her voice steady despite the weight of their scrutiny. Then one of the men leaned back in his chair and asked a question that shifted the air. "Miss Williams," he said, folding his hands, "how would you respond to those who suggest your community struggles with structural discipline?" The phrasing was careful. The meaning was not. Ruby felt heat rise in her chest. She understood what he was implying, that Harlem lacked refinement, that perhaps she lacked it. By association. She did not flinch. "My community," she said evenly, "struggles with limited opportunity, not limited discipline." A pause. The woman on the panel exchanged a glance with one of the men. Another question followed, sharper. "Are you aware that certain individuals from your neighborhood have been associated with controversial figures?" There it was. They were not asking about her education. They were asking about Bumpy. Ruby realized, in that moment, that this was not merely an academic review. It was a test of allegiance. "I am aware." she replied calmly, that my neighborhood contains complex individuals, as does every neighborhood in this city. The interview ended shortly after. No smiles, no assurances, just a polite dismissal. When Ruby stepped back into the rain, something felt wrong. Not the kind of wrong that shouted, the kind that lingered. Back in Harlem, Bumpy received word before she even returned home. He did not ask how. He simply understood the pattern. They could not close the bookstore again without scrutiny. So they aimed at her future. That evening, Ruby sat across from him in the small apartment above the restaurant, eyes red but dry. They questioned my character, she said quietly, without saying it directly. Bumpy listened. They asked about you, she added. He nodded once. And I defended my community, she said. A faint pride touched his expression. I expected nothing less. She looked at him then, searching for something deeper. Did you know this would happen? He did not answer immediately. Yes, he said finally. Silence settled heavily between them. You let me walk into it? She asked softly. His voice remained calm, but there was gravity beneath it. If I had stopped it, they would have denied you quietly, without explanation. This way, they showed themselves. She clenched her hands together. And if they still deny me, then we respond. How? Bumpy rose slowly and walked to his desk. He opened a drawer and removed a sealed envelope. I have letters, he said. From educators. From clergy. From people whose names carry weight far beyond Harlem. She stared at him. You prepared? I anticipated. The next day, a formal letter of rejection arrived. It cited competitive selection criteria and limited placement availability. No mention of her performance. No acknowledgement of her qualifications. Ruby, read it once. Then again. Her father sat silently beside her. That evening, Bumpy requested a meeting, not with Dutch, with the college's primary donor. The donor was a philanthropist, known publicly for championing educational reform. Privately, he valued reputation above all. The meeting took place in a quiet office overlooking Central Park. The philanthropist expected confrontation. Instead, he received composure. Bumpy placed the sealed envelope on the desk. These, he said calmly, are endorsements for Miss Ruby Williams from respected leaders across this city. The philanthropist raised an eyebrow. And Bumpy continued evenly. I believe your institution values integrity in its selection process. Of course. Then you would not want it known that external influence has compromised that process. The philanthropist's expression tightened. Are you accusing us? I am presenting you with documentation, Bumpy replied, sliding a second folder forward. Transcripts, interview notes, witness accounts. Silence. Bumpy's voice lowered slightly. Miss Williams does not require charity. She requires fairness. The philanthropist understood the subtext. Public scandal would stain the college's name. Quiet correction would preserve it. 2 days later, a second letter arrived at Williams and daughter. This one bore different language. We are pleased to inform you. Ruby read it aloud, hands trembling. Her father covered his mouth. Outside, Harlem's evening air felt electric. Ruby walked to Bumpy's apartment without waiting. When she entered, she did not speak immediately. She simply held up the letter. Read her expression before reading the words. Congratulations, he said softly. You did this. No, he corrected gently. You earned it. Tears finally broke free. They tried to use you against me, he added quietly. But you stood taller than they expected. She looked at him through wet lashes. Why didn't you fight louder? He smiled faintly. Because sometimes the loudest victory, he said, is the one no one can publicly oppose. Across town, Dutch received the news with controlled irritation. He had not lost power, but he had been forced to retreat, and retreat did not sit well with men accustomed to dominance. He stared out at the city skyline, understanding something now. With greater clarity, Bumpy Johnson did not fight like other men, that he did not escalate, that he redirected. He did not crush opponents, he cornered them, with their own values, and that made him far more dangerous than anyone who relied on force. Back in Harlem, the bookstore lights glowed brighter than ever. The acceptance letter sat framed on the bookstore wall, just above the counter where Ruby had once arranged ink bottles and poetry collections. Customers touched the frame gently when they passed, as if it were something sacred. For Harlem, it was more than a scholarship. It was proof. Proof that dignity could win without breaking windows. Proof that patience could outmaneuver pressure. But symbols do not disappear when challenged. They grow, and growth unsettles men who measure influence by obedience. Dutch Schultz had watched carefully. He had adjusted. He had stepped back when public light became inconvenient, but he had not forgotten, not the article, not the donor meeting, not the subtle redirection of power that left him appearing heavy-handed while Bumpy stood composed. Dutch understood something clearly now. As long as Bumpy remained respected, manipulation would always carry risk. And if he could not fracture the bookstore, if he could not block the scholarship, then he would attempt something quieter. Isolation. One evening, just weeks before Ruby's departure for college, Bumpy received an unexpected invitation, a private dinner, neutral location. No associates. He accepted. The restaurant was elegant, but discreet, one of those establishments where conversations were absorbed by thick carpets and crystal glasses. Dutch was already seated when Bumpy arrived, coat removed, expression measured. Ellsworth. Dutch greeted smoothly. Dutch. They shook hands, firm, calm. No hostility. Just awareness. Dinner was ordered. Wine poured. For several minutes, conversation remained almost civil. Business trends, city politics, economic shifts. Two powerful men speaking as if rivalry were merely rumor. Then Dutch leaned back slightly. "You've done impressive work lately," he said. Bumpy remained still. "Clarifying misunderstandings." Dutch smiled faintly. "You're admired in Harlem. I respect Harlem. That's not what I said." The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Dutch's eyes sharpened. "You could have more." "More? Legitimacy." Dutch said evenly. "Protection beyond neighborhood lines. Influence recognized, not tolerated." Bumpy did not respond immediately. Dutch continued, voice steady. "Align with me, publicly, quietly, it doesn't matter. Your community thrives. Your bookstore flourishes. Ruby's future remains untouched." There it was, not a threat. An offer. Bumpy lifted his glass, studied the wine as though it held answers. "And if I decline?" he asked calmly. Dutch's smile did not fade, but something colder entered his tone. "The city can be unpredictable." Silence settled heavily. The restaurant felt warmer now. Bumpy placed his glass down carefully. "You're asking me," he said quietly, "to trade respect for comfort." Dutch shrugged lightly. "I'm offering security." "Security built on silence," Bumpy corrected. Dutch leaned forward slightly. "Every man bends somewhere, Ellsworth. The wise choose where." Bumpy met his gaze fully. "And the strong," he replied, "choose not to." For the first time in their conversations, tension tightened visibly. Dutch exhaled slowly. "You protect everyone." "Who protects you?" Bumpy's voice did not rise. "I don't require protection." Dinner ended shortly after. No raised voices. No public scene. But something had changed. 2 nights later, Bumpy's apartment was searched by city authorities, not violently. Not DESTR. UCTIVEO. Why? Officially. Tax inquiries, licensing reviews, business audits. Nothing dramatic. Just inconvenience, paperwork, pressure. Word spread quickly through Harlem. Men offered to retaliate. Others suggested confrontation. Bumpy refused. Them all, We will not give anyone reason to justify escalation, he said calmly. But privately, the pressure was real. Bank accounts were temporarily frozen pending review. Certain suppliers delayed shipments. Meetings were canceled without explanation. Dutch had not attacked directly. He had tightened air supply. Ruby noticed the change immediately. You're being squeezed, she said one evening in his apartment. Her scholarship departure only days away. He smiled faintly. Pressure reveals structure. Why don't you fight? He looked at her carefully. Because sometimes, he said, fighting gives your opponent the war he wants. She hesitated before speaking again. Is this my fault? The question hung in the air like something fragile. Bumpy's expression softened. Never, he said firmly. If I hadn't, you earned your place, he interrupted gently. And I would protect that opportunity again. But they're coming for you. He walked to the window, looking out over Harlem's rooftops glowing under evening lights. They're testing whether I stand alone. Do you? He did not answer immediately. That Sunday, without announcement, something remarkable happened. The pastor who had once spoken at Ruby's funeral months earlier stood at the pulpit and addressed the congregation. Integrity, he said, is not convenient. It is costly, but it is contagious. After the service, shop owners who had once accepted protection agreements quietly began canceling them. Clergy wrote letters affirming Bumpy's role in preserving community dignity. Educators spoke publicly about Ruby's scholarship as a symbol of fairness achieved through patience. No protests. No violence. Just unified voice. By Tuesday morning, the audits were quietly resolved. The tax review concluded with no violations. The licensing questions disappeared. Bank restrictions lifted. Dutch received the message clearly. Pressure applied to Bumpy had not isolated him. It had revealed his foundation. And foundation built on community is far harder to fracture than foundation built on fear. That evening, Dutch requested one final meeting. This time, it was shorter. No more complications, Dutch said plainly. No more coercion. Bumpy replied calmly. A long pause passed between them. Dutch studied him with something almost like reluctant respect. You could have chosen comfort. I chose consistency. Dutch nodded once. Harlem remains yours, he said. Bumpy shook his head slightly. Harlem belongs to itself. They stood. No handshake this time, just acknowledgement. The battle had never been about territory. It had been about tone. Days later, Ruby boarded the train that would take her toward her new future. The platform was crowded. Neighbors, teachers, children she had tutored. Bumpy stood slightly back from the crowd, hat low, hands folded behind him. Ruby approached him last. You never told me, she said softly, why you fight this way. He adjusted his hat slightly. Because loud power fades, he replied. Quiet power lasts. She smiled through tears. I'll make you proud. You already have. The train whistle blew. As it pulled away, Ruby leaned out the window, waving until Harlem blurred into distance. Bumpy remained still long after the train disappeared. Not triumphant, not relieved. Just steady. That night, the bookstore lights remained on again, not as defiance, not as spectacle, but as continuity. Dutch Schultz stood in his office overlooking the city skyline. He had not lost everything, but he had learned something. There are men who command fear, and there are men who command respect. Only one of those survives beyond reputation. Weeks later, a letter arrived at the bookstore from Ruby. She wrote about lectures, about new libraries, about students who had never set foot in Harlem, but now listened when she spoke of it. At the bottom of the letter she wrote, they tried to bend U.S. They failed. Bumpy folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a book of poetry. Outside, Harlem moved forward, not untouched by pressure, not free from struggle, but strengthened. Because sometimes the greatest victory is not defeating, An enemy. It is refusing to become one. And long after the names of powerful men fade from headlines, the lights in Williams and Daughter books and stationery continued to glow. Steady. Unshaken. UNB.